The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered gardens of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood by the tall windows of his private study. The December air was crisp and cold, but, inside the castle, warmth radiated from the crackling fireplace. Today was different from any other Christmas preparation he had experienced in his 76 years of life. This would be his third Christmas speech as king, but the first where his entire family would stand beside him, united in a way that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Charles adjusted his navy blue suit jacket and touched the small photograph on his mahogany desk. It was a picture from the previous Christmas, showing him alone at the podium, delivering his message to the Commonwealth. The image reminded him of how isolated he had felt during those early months of his reign, when the weight of the crown seemed heavier than ever, and family tensions ran high like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor outside his study. Charles recognized the familiar pattern immediately. It was Catherine, the Princess of Wales, walking with her characteristic grace and purpose. Even through the thick wooden door, he could sense her presence, the calm strength that had become the backbone of the royal family during the most challenging times. Catherine knocked gently before entering. She wore a deep emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was styled in soft waves that framed her face. Her smile was genuine and warm, the kind that had captured the hearts of the British people and had helped heal wounds that once seemed impossible to mend. "Your Majesty," she said with a small curtsy, though her tone was affectionate rather than formal. Over the years, Charles had grown to love Catherine like the daughter he never had. She possessed qualities that reminded him of his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, an unwavering sense of duty combined with genuine compassion for others. "Catherine, my dear," Charles replied, his voice carrying the warmth of a grandfather speaking to a beloved family member. "How are the boys this morning? Are they ready for our little adventure?" Catherine's eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and gentle concern. "Prince George is practically bouncing off the walls with anticipation. He's been asking about the speech every 5 minutes since he woke up. Prince Louis, on the other hand, is more interested in whether there will be Christmas pudding after the filming." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "And Prince William?" The question hung in the air between them. William's relationship with his father had been complicated for years, marked by disagreements about royal duties, personal choices, and the painful memories of his mother's death. But something had shifted in recent months, a gradual thawing that both men had been too proud to acknowledge directly. "He'll be here," Charles said quietly, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "He promised he would be here." Catherine moved closer to the window where Charles stood, and together they looked out at the sprawling grounds of Windsor Castle. The ancient oak trees were bare, their branches reaching toward the pale winter sky like arms in prayer. In the distance, they could see the small crew setting up equipment in the castle's blue drawing room, where the Christmas speech would be recorded. "You know," Catherine said softly, "this means everything to him, even if he doesn't say it out loud. William has been carrying so much weight on his shoulders, trying to balance being a father, a husband, and a future king. Having his family stand with him today, having you stand with him, it's more important than you might realize." Charles nodded, remembering his own struggles when he was William's age. The pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, to carry the expectations of an entire nation while still trying to be a good father and husband. He had made mistakes along the way, choices that had caused pain to the people he loved most. But perhaps it wasn't too late to build something better, something stronger. "I've been thinking about my mother a great deal lately," Charles admitted. "She had this remarkable ability to bring the family together, especially during Christmas. Even when we disagreed about things, even when the press was being particularly harsh, she could create this sense of unity that made everything else fade into the background." Catherine placed a gentle hand on Charles's arm. "She would be so proud of what you're trying to do today. Bringing the family together for the Christmas speech isn't just about tradition or public relations. It's about showing the world that even royal families go through difficult times, but love and forgiveness can heal almost any wound." The sound of children's laughter echoed from somewhere deep within the castle, growing louder as small feet ran across marble floors. Prince George and Prince Louis were approaching, their excitement barely contained. Charles felt his heart lift at the sound. His grandsons had become one of the greatest joys of his life, reminding him of the simple pleasures that existed beyond the formality of royal duties. Prince George appeared in the doorway first, his blonde hair slightly tousled despite Catherine's earlier efforts to tame it. At 12 years old, he was beginning to understand the weight of his future role, but today he looked like any other excited child on Christmas Eve. "Grandpa King," George called out, using the special name he had given Charles when he was much younger. "Are we really going to be on television with you? Will everyone in England see us?" Charles knelt down to George's level, his formal posture melting away as he became simply a grandfather talking to his grandson. "Not just England, my boy. People all around the world will see us. But, more importantly, they'll see that we're a family who loves each other very much." Prince Louis, now 7 years old, peered around his brother with wide, curious eyes. He was still young enough to be more interested in the adventure than the significance of the moment. "Will there be cameras everywhere? Can I wave at them?" "You can wave if you'd like," Catherine said, smoothing Louis's hair with a mother's practiced touch. "But, remember what we talked about? We're going to stand very quietly while Grandpa King gives his speech, and then, afterward, we'll have our special Christmas tea." Charles stood up, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded him of his first public speech decades ago. But this was different. This wasn't about him proving himself as a monarch, it was about showing the world that the royal family, like any family, could overcome challenges and find strength in unity. "Where's Papa?" Louis asked, looking around the study as if William might be hiding behind one of the tall bookshelves. "He's coming," Charles said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. He had some last-minute preparations to take care of. Catherine caught Charles's eye and gave him a small, reassuring nod. She understood the delicate nature of the situation better than anyone. William's decision to participate in the joint Christmas speech had not been made lightly. For months, there had been discussions, sometimes heated, about the direction of the monarchy and how the family should present itself to the public. The recent health challenges that both Charles and Catherine had faced earlier in the year had served as a wake-up call for everyone. Life was precious and unpredictable, and old grudges seemed less important when confronted with the reality of mortality. The cancer diagnoses had forced difficult conversations about forgiveness, family, and what truly mattered in life. "Tell us about Christmas when you were little, Grandpa King," George said, settling into one of the leather chairs that were almost too big for him. "Did you have Christmas speeches then, too?" Charles smiled at the question, remembering himself as a young boy, watching his mother prepare for her annual Christmas broadcast. "Well, your great-grandmother Queen Elizabeth started giving Christmas speeches when I was about your age, George. I remember sitting in a room very much like this one, watching her practice her words over and over again until they were perfect." "Was she nervous?" Louis asked, climbing onto the arm of George's chair despite Catherine's gentle look of disapproval. "I think she was, sometimes," Charles replied honestly. But she never let it show. She believed that the Christmas speech was one of the most important things she did each year because it was a chance to speak directly to people's hearts, to remind them that no matter what challenges they faced, there was always hope for better days ahead. Catherine moved to the window again, checking her watch discreetly. The filming was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and William still hadn't arrived. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text message, hoping for a response that would ease the growing tension in the room. "Mama, is Papa coming?" George asked, his young intuition picking up on the adult's unspoken concerns. "Of course he is, sweetheart," Catherine replied, her voice steady and reassuring. "He promised he would be here, and Papa always keeps his promises." Charles watched this exchange and felt a deep admiration for Catherine's ability to remain calm under pressure. She had learned to navigate the complexities of royal life while still maintaining her authenticity and warmth. In many ways, she had become the stabilizing force that the family needed during uncertain times. The study door opened again, and a member of the castle staff appeared. "Your Majesty, the production team is ready for the final rehearsal whenever you are." Charles nodded. "Thank you. We'll be down in just a few minutes." As the staff member departed, Charles turned to his family. "Well then, shall we go and practice?" Even if William is running a bit late, we can still prepare everything else." George and Louis jumped up with enthusiasm, their earlier excitement returning in full force. Catherine gathered her small purse and checked her appearance one final time in the mirror that hung near the door. "Grandpa King," George said as they prepared to leave the study, "what are you going to say in your speech? Is it going to be different because we're with you?" Charles paused, considering the question carefully. "You know, George, I think it will be different. When I'm standing up there alone, I sometimes forget that I'm talking to real people, mothers and fathers, grandparents and children, people who are celebrating Christmas just like we are. But, with all of you beside me, I'll remember that the most important message anyone can share at Christmas is that love is stronger than anything else in the world." As they walked through the corridors of Windsor Castle toward the blue drawing room, Charles felt a sense of anticipation that he hadn't experienced in years. The ancient walls seemed to whisper with the memories of countless Christmas celebrations, generations of royals who had gathered here to mark the holiday season. The blue drawing room had been transformed for the occasion. Soft lighting created a warm, intimate atmosphere, while cameras and sound equipment were positioned to capture every detail of the historic moment. A beautiful Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with traditional ornaments that had been used by the royal family for decades. Charles took his place behind the ornate desk where he would deliver his speech, while Catherine helped position George and Louis nearby. The boys were fascinated by all the technical equipment and had to be gently reminded to stay out of the camera operator's way. "This is really happening, isn't it?" George whispered to his mother, his voice filled with wonder. "Yes, darling," Catherine replied. "This is really happening." As the final preparations continued around them, Charles found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The challenges, the misunderstandings, the painful periods of estrangement, all of it had led to this opportunity to stand together as a family and share a message of hope with the world. But, still, one crucial piece was missing. William's empty space seemed to grow larger with each passing minute, and Charles couldn't help but wonder if this Christmas would end in disappointment after all. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward the scheduled filming time, each second carrying the weight of years of complicated family dynamics and the hope for healing that seemed so close yet still uncertain. The tension in the blue drawing room was almost palpable as the minutes ticked by. Charles stood behind the ornate mahogany desk, adjusting his tie for the third time in 5 minutes, while Catherine helped George and Louis practice standing quietly beside their grandfather. The production crew moved around them with professional efficiency, making final adjustments to lighting and camera angles, but even they seemed to sense that something was amiss. "Your Majesty," the director approached Charles with a respectful bow, "we're ready to begin the rehearsal whenever you are. Should we wait a bit longer, or would you prefer to proceed?" Charles glanced at Catherine, who gave him a subtle shake of her head. Her phone had remained silent despite the messages she had sent to William. Her composed exterior couldn't completely hide the worry in her eyes, though she continued to smile reassuringly at her sons. "Let's give it another few minutes," Charles replied, his voice steady despite the growing anxiety in his chest. He had learned over the decades to maintain his composure in public, but, privately, he felt like a father waiting for his son to come home after a terrible argument. Prince Louis tugged on his mother's emerald dress. "Mama, why isn't Papa here yet? Did he forget about us?" The innocent question cut through Catherine's heart like a knife. She knelt down to Louis's level, her hands gently holding his small shoulders. "Papa would never forget about us, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have very important things they need to take care of, but that doesn't mean they don't love us." George, who at 12 was beginning to understand the complexities of adult relationships, moved closer to his mother and brother. "It's okay, Louis. Papa will be here. He promised Grandpa King, and Papa always keeps his promises to family." Charles watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. His grandchildren's faith in their father was absolute, and he prayed that William wouldn't disappoint them. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had once been in William's position, struggling to balance duty and personal feelings, sometimes failing to show up when his family needed him most. The massive windows of the blue drawing room faced east, and, through them, Charles could see the long driveway that wound through the Windsor Castle grounds. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift in that direction, hoping to catch sight of William's familiar Range Rover making its way toward the castle. Your Majesty, one of the camera operators called softly, we have everything ready for the technical run-through. Would you like to practice your opening lines? Charles nodded and cleared his throat. He had written and rewritten his speech multiple times over the past week, each draft reflecting his evolving thoughts about family, forgiveness, and the year that had challenged them all in unexpected ways. My dear friends across the Commonwealth and around the world, Charles began, his voice taking on the measured, compassionate tone that had become his signature as king. This Christmas finds us gathered not just in celebration of our Savior's birth, but in gratitude for the bonds that hold us together through life's most difficult trials. As he spoke these practice words, Catherine felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She knew how much this speech meant to Charles, how he had poured his heart into every sentence. The king had faced his own mortality earlier that year when doctors had discovered his cancer, and the experience had changed his perspective on what truly mattered in life. George stood very straight beside the desk, his young face serious as he tried to embody the dignity his position would someday require. But Louis fidgeted slightly, his 7-year-old attention span beginning to waver as the adults continued their preparations around him. "Grandpa King," Louis whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "can I ask you something?" Charles paused his rehearsal and smiled down at his youngest grandson. "Of course, Louis. What would you like to know? When you talk to all those people on the television, do you ever get scared?" The question was so honest and direct that it caught Charles off guard. In all his years of public speaking, no one had ever asked him such a simple yet profound question. He looked around the room at the cameras and crew members, all waiting for his response. "You know what, Louis?" Charles said, abandoning his formal posture and speaking directly to his grandson. "I do get scared sometimes. Speaking to millions of people is quite frightening, even for a king. But, do you know what makes me feel brave?" Louis shook his head, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Knowing that the people I love most in the world are right here with me," Charles replied. "When your grandmother and I are standing together, when we have family around us, it reminds me that we're never really alone, even when things seem difficult." Catherine watched this tender exchange between grandfather and grandson, and she felt her phone vibrate in her small purse. Her heart leaped as she quickly checked the message, hoping it was from William. Instead, it was from her own mother, sending Christmas wishes from Berkshire where the Middleton family was preparing for their own holiday celebration. The disappointment must have shown on her face because George immediately noticed. "Mama? Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, darling," Catherine replied, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. She was torn between her role as a supportive daughter-in-law to Charles and her loyalty to her husband, whatever reasons he might have for his delay. Charles resumed his position behind the desk and continued with his rehearsal. "This year has taught us that life is precious and unpredictable. We have faced challenges that tested our strength, our faith, and our commitment to one another. But we have also discovered that when we choose love over pride, forgiveness over resentment, we find a peace that surpasses all understanding." The words hung in the air with particular poignancy, given William's absence. Charles had written these lines thinking specifically about his relationship with his eldest son, about the years of misunderstandings and hurt feelings that had created distance between them. The cancer diagnosis had forced both men to confront their mortality and the possibility that time for reconciliation might be shorter than they had assumed. "Should we try blocking the positions one more time?" the director asked gently. "Just so everyone knows exactly where to stand when we're ready to film?" Catherine nodded and helped guide George and Louis to their designated spots. George would stand to Charles's right, his young face serious and dignified, while Louis would be positioned slightly in front, where his natural charm and innocence would be visible to viewers. Catherine herself would stand behind and to the left, her presence providing a sense of stability and continuity. But the empty space where William should have been standing seemed to grow larger and more obvious with each passing minute. The production crew had prepared a spot for the Prince of Wales next to his father, a position that would have symbolized the continuity of the monarchy and the strength of their relationship. "Grandpa King," George said during a brief break in the rehearsal, "can I tell you something?" "Of course, my boy. What's on your mind?" George glanced around to make sure the adults weren't listening too closely, then moved closer to his grandfather. Papa has been really worried about today. I heard him talking to Mama last night, and he said he wanted to make sure he didn't disappoint you. Charles felt his breath catch in his throat. Did he really say that? George nodded solemnly. He said that being here with you was one of the most important things he could do, but he was scared that he might not know the right words to say. The revelation hit Charles with the force of a physical blow. All this time, he had been worried that William might not show up because he didn't care enough, when in reality, his son might be struggling with the exact opposite problem, caring too much and fearing that he would somehow fail to meet expectations. Catherine, who had been pretending not to listen to the conversation, felt her heart break for both her husband and her father-in-law. She understood William's fears better than anyone. He had spent his entire adult life preparing to be king, but he had also watched his father struggle with the weight of the crown and the constant scrutiny that came with it. "Your Majesty," one of the production assistants approached hesitantly, "we really should begin filming soon. The broadcast schedule is quite tight, and we still need time for editing." Charles looked at his watch and realized that they had already delayed the filming by 30 minutes. The Christmas speech was scheduled to air in just a few hours, and there were technical requirements that couldn't be pushed back indefinitely. "Just a few more minutes," Charles replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. He was faced with an impossible choice: proceed without William and potentially damage their relationship further, or continue waiting and risk creating problems for the entire production. Catherine made a decision. She walked over to Charles and spoke in a low voice that the children couldn't hear. "Your Majesty, perhaps I should try calling William directly. He might not be receiving text messages, or there might be some sort of emergency we don't know about." Charles nodded gratefully. "Please do. And, Catherine, thank you for everything you've done to bring this family together. Your mother-in-law would be so proud of the woman you've become." The mention of Diana's name hung in the air between them. Catherine had always felt the weight of following in the footsteps of such a beloved figure, but she had found her own way to serve the crown and the people while remaining true to herself. As Catherine stepped into the corridor to make her phone call, Charles gathered his grandsons around him. The blue drawing room, with its pale blue silk wall coverings and ornate gilded furniture, had witnessed countless historic moments over the centuries. Royal children had played here, important decisions had been made, and now it was about to host what Charles hoped would be a new chapter in the monarchy story. "Boys," Charles said, sitting down in one of the upholstered chairs so that he was at their eye level, "I want you to know how proud I am of both of you. Standing here with me today, helping me share our Christmas message with the world, it means more to me than you can possibly understand." "Are we really helping?" Louis asked, his face brightening at the thought that he was doing something important. "You absolutely are," Charles assured him. "When people see us together as a family, when they see that we care about each other and support each other, it gives them hope for their own families. Sometimes the most powerful message we can share isn't what we say with words, but what we show through our actions." George, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who grow up in unique circumstances, looked thoughtfully at his grandfather. "Grandpa King, do you think Papa is scared because he loves us too much?" The question was so perceptive that Charles had to take a moment to compose himself before answering. "I think you might be exactly right, George. Sometimes when we love someone very much, we become so worried about disappointing them that we end up hurting them instead." From the corridor, they could hear Catherine's voice speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Charles couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested that she had reached William and that they were having an intense conversation. "Your Majesty," the director approached again, his expression apologetic but firm, "I'm afraid we really must begin filming now. The technical crew has other commitments this afternoon, and we need to maintain the broadcast schedule." Charles looked toward the corridor where Catherine had disappeared, then at his grandsons who were watching him with complete trust and expectation. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the crown itself, heavy with responsibility and consequence. "All right," Charles said finally, rising from his chair and straightening his jacket. "Let's begin. We'll start with the opening, and if William arrives during filming, we can incorporate him into the later portions." George and Louis took their positions beside the desk, their small faces serious with the gravity of the moment. Charles moved behind the mahogany surface, his hands resting lightly on the speech he had crafted with such care over the past weeks. The cameras began to roll, and Charles felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever he stepped into his public role. His personal worries and fears receded into the background as he focused on the millions of people who would hear his words in just a few hours. "My dear friends across the Commonwealth and around the world," Charles began, his voice carrying the warmth and authority that had made him a respected monarch, "this Christmas finds us gathered not just in celebration, but in profound gratitude for the love that binds us together through every season of life." As he spoke, Catherine quietly returned to the room, taking her position behind the boys. Her face was composed, but Charles could see something in her eyes, hope, perhaps, or relief. She caught his gaze for just a moment and gave him the slightest nod, as if to say that everything would be all right. The speech continued, each word carefully chosen to reflect the themes of family, forgiveness, and hope that had become so important to Charles during this transformative year. George and Louis stood perfectly still, their young faces serious and dignified, while Catherine's presence provided a sense of stability and grace that viewers around the world would find deeply comforting. But, even as Charles delivered his message with conviction and warmth, a part of his mind remained focused on the empty space beside him, hoping against hope that his son would still find his way home. Charles was halfway through his Christmas speech when he heard it, the distant sound of car doors closing in the castle courtyard below. His heart skipped a beat, but he maintained his composure, continuing to speak about the importance of community and shared values while his ears strained to identify the approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. "In times of uncertainty," Charles continued, his voice steady despite the racing of his pulse, "we find our greatest strength not in standing alone, but in standing together. This year has reminded us all that life is fragile, precious, and unpredictable. We have learned that the bonds of family, tested by time and trial, can emerge stronger than we ever imagined possible." George and Louis remained perfectly still beside their grandfather, though Louis's eyes flickered toward the door when he too heard movement in the hallway. Catherine, standing behind her sons, felt her breath catch as she recognized the familiar sound of William's footsteps approaching the blue drawing room. The production crew, professional to the core, continued filming without interruption, but several of them exchanged meaningful glances. They had been briefed about the family dynamics at play and understood the significance of what might be about to happen. "The Christmas story teaches us about hope arriving when we least expect it," Charles continued, and the words seemed to take on a prophetic quality as the footsteps grew closer. "About love overcoming fear, and about the possibility of new beginnings even in our darkest hours." The door to the blue drawing room opened quietly, and William, Prince of Wales, stepped inside. He was dressed in a navy blue suit that complemented his father's attire, his hair slightly windswept from his journey. His face carried the weight of internal struggle, but also determination, the look of a man who had made a difficult decision and was committed to seeing it through. William paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene before him. His father standing behind the ornate desk, delivering words that seemed to speak directly to their relationship. His wife Catherine, beautiful and composed, providing the stability that had become her signature. And his sons, George and Louis, standing with such dignity and grace that it made his chest tight with pride and love. Charles saw his son from the corner of his eye but didn't break his concentration. Instead, he continued with his speech, though his voice took on a deeper warmth as he spoke the words he had written specifically with this moment in mind. "Forgiveness," Charles said, "is perhaps the greatest gift we can give to one another. Not because it erases the pain of the past, but because it opens the door to a future filled with possibility. When we choose to forgive, we choose hope over bitterness, love over resentment, and unity over division." William moved quietly across the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. The cameras followed his movements subtly, the operators experienced enough to capture this historic moment without disrupting the flow of the speech. Catherine reached out and gently touched William's arm as he approached, a gesture of support and welcome that spoke volumes about their relationship. She had been his anchor through the most challenging periods of his life, helping him navigate the complex emotions surrounding his father, his role, and his responsibilities. "Papa," Louis whispered, his young voice barely audible but filled with relief and joy. William placed a gentle hand on Louis's shoulder, then moved to stand beside his father at the desk. The empty space that had seemed so glaring just moments before was now filled, and the family portrait was complete. Charles felt William's presence like a warm light beside him. Without missing a beat in his speech, he shifted slightly to accommodate his son, and William took his position with natural grace, as if he had been there from the beginning. This year, Charles continued, his voice now carrying a quality of profound gratitude, my family and I have learned that strength comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them together. We have discovered that even the deepest wounds can heal when we approach them with humility, honesty, and love. William stood tall beside his father, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him as he listened to words that seemed to encapsulate everything he had struggled to express over the past months. The cancer diagnoses that had struck both his father and his wife had forced him to confront his own mortality and the fragility of the relationships he held most dear. The production crew captured every nuance of this moment, the way William's jaw tightened as he fought back emotion, the subtle smile that crossed Catherine's face as she watched her husband take his place beside his father, the way George and Louis seemed to stand even straighter now that their family was complete. To those watching around the world who may be facing their own family challenges, Charles said, his eyes briefly meeting William's before returning to the camera, I want you to know that reconciliation is always possible. It requires courage, certainly. It demands that we set aside our pride and our need to be right. But the reward, the restoration of love and trust, is worth every difficult conversation, every moment of vulnerability. William felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he listened to his father speak. These words were meant for him, he knew, but they were also meant for every family struggling with similar issues around the world. The monarchy's greatest power had always been its ability to reflect the experiences of ordinary people while providing hope and inspiration for better days ahead. The birth of Christ reminds us that God enters our world not in power and majesty, but in vulnerability and love, Charles continued. A tiny baby, dependent on his family for everything, yet carrying within him the power to change the world. This Christmas, as we gather with those we love, let us remember that the smallest gestures of forgiveness and kindness can have the most profound impact. George watched his father and grandfather standing side by side, and felt a sense of completion that he hadn't even realized he was missing. At 12 years old, he was beginning to understand the complexities of adult relationships and the courage it required for his father to be here today. The cameras continued to roll as Charles moved into the final portion of his speech. William found himself remembering Christmas mornings from his childhood, before the complexities of adult life had created distance between him and his father. He thought about his mother Diana, and how she had always encouraged him to lead with his heart. Standing here today, supporting his father while being supported by his wife and children, felt like the kind of choice she would have been proud of. As we celebrate this Christmas together, Charles said, his voice taking on the cadence of a blessing, let us carry forward the message of hope, love, and reconciliation. Let us be brave enough to reach out to those we may have been separated from. Let us be generous enough to forgive, and humble enough to ask for forgiveness when we have caused harm. Catherine watched her family standing together and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The past year had tested them in ways they never could have imagined. Her own cancer diagnosis had brought the family together in new ways, forcing difficult conversations about what truly mattered. Watching Charles and William work through their relationship had been painful at times, but seeing them now, united in purpose and love, made every challenging moment worthwhile. In closing, Charles said, preparing for the final words of his speech, I want to thank you for your continued support, your prayers during our family's health challenges this year, and your patience as we, like all families, continue to learn and grow together. From my family to yours, from our hearts to your homes, we wish you a Christmas filled with peace, joy, and the certain knowledge that you are deeply loved. As Charles concluded his speech, a moment of profound silence filled the blue drawing room. William turned to face his father fully, and the two men looked at each other with an understanding that transcended words. Years of hurt and misunderstanding seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by the recognition of shared love and common purpose. Thank you, William said quietly, his words meant for his father but audible to everyone in the room. Thank you for including us. Thank you for everything. Charles felt his composure finally begin to crack. Thank you for coming home, son. The cameras captured this intimate moment between father and son, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something historic, not just for the royal family, but for families everywhere who struggle with forgiveness and reconciliation. George and Louis looked up at their father and grandfather with shining eyes, sensing the importance of what had just transpired even if they didn't fully understand all the complexities involved. Catherine moved to join her husband, and Charles reached out to include her in what became a spontaneous family embrace. "That's a wrap," the director called softly, recognizing that nothing they could script or stage would be more powerful than this authentic moment of family reunion and love. As the cameras stopped rolling and the production crew began to pack up their equipment, the royal family remained standing together, reluctant to break the spell of this perfect moment. Outside, snow had begun to fall gently across the Windsor Castle grounds, adding a magical quality to what was already feeling like a Christmas miracle. "I'm sorry I was late," William said, addressing his father but including Catherine and the boys in his gaze. "I almost didn't come. I was scared that I would say the wrong thing, or that my presence would somehow diminish what you were trying to accomplish." Charles shook his head firmly. "Your presence could never diminish anything, William. You are my son, and you belong here. We belong together. Can we watch ourselves on television later?" Louis asked, breaking the emotional intensity with the practical curiosity of a 7-year-old. Everyone laughed, the sound breaking the tension and reminding them that despite their royal status, they were fundamentally just a family who loved each other. "Of course we can," Catherine said, ruffling Louis's hair. "We'll make some hot chocolate and watch together, just like any other family on Christmas Day." As they prepared to leave the blue drawing room, Charles took one last look around the ornate space where so much history had been made, and where today, a new chapter in their family's story had been written. The Christmas speech would air in just a few hours, but the real gift had already been given, the restoration of trust, love, and unity that would serve as the foundation for whatever challenges lay ahead. William placed his arm around his father's shoulders as they walked toward the door, a gesture that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Catherine followed with George and Louis, her heart full of gratitude for the healing that had taken place and hope for the future they would build together. The snow continued to fall outside Windsor Castle, blanketing the ancient grounds in pristine white and creating the perfect backdrop for what had turned out to be a truly perfect Christmas morning. The afternoon sun cast golden light through the tall windows of the private dining room at Windsor Castle as the royal family gathered around an intimate table set for 6. The formal Christmas speech had been completed, edited, and was now ready to broadcast to millions of people around the world in just a few hours. But, for now, they were simply a family sharing Christmas tea together, away from cameras and the weight of their public roles. Catherine poured tea from a delicate china service that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, the familiar ritual bringing comfort and normalcy to what had been an emotionally charged day. The boys had changed out of their formal suits into comfortable jumpers, and even Charles had loosened his tie and seemed more relaxed than he had in months. "Grandpa King," Louis said, reaching for a small sandwich from the tiered serving tray, "when everyone watches us on television tonight, do you think they'll know that Papa was scared?" William nearly choked on his tea at his younger son's directness. "Louis, what makes you think I was scared?" "Because you kept checking your watch in the car, and you made Mama call you 3 times before you came inside," Louis replied matter-of-factly, his 7-year-old honesty cutting straight to the truth. George giggled at his brother's observation. "And you kept asking if your hair looked all right, even though Mama had already told you it was fine." William looked around the table at his family, all of whom were trying not to smile too obviously at his son's perceptive comments. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and vulnerability, "I suppose there's no point in denying it. I was terrified." Charles set down his teacup and looked at his son with compassion. "What frightened you the most?" The question hung in the air between them, and William took a moment to consider his answer carefully. The past year had forced him to confront so many fears, about his father's health, about Catherine's cancer diagnosis, about his own readiness to eventually become king, and, most of all, about the state of his relationship with Charles. "I was afraid of disappointing you," William said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I was afraid that I would say something wrong, or stand in the wrong place, or somehow diminish the message you wanted to share. But, more than that, I was afraid that showing up would be too little, too late. That I had already damaged our relationship beyond repair." Catherine reached across the table and placed her hand over William's, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Charles. He had always been grateful for the way Catherine had helped bridge the gap between him and William, never taking sides but always encouraging understanding and communication. "My dear boy," Charles said, using an endearment he hadn't spoken in years, "nothing you could ever do would damage our relationship beyond repair. Yes, we've had our differences. Yes, there have been times when we've hurt each other with our words and our actions. But you are my son, and that bond is stronger than any disagreement or misunderstanding." George, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the seriousness that came naturally to him, spoke up suddenly. "Papa, did you know that Grandpa King kept looking out the window for your car? He was worried about you too." The simple observation from his 12-year-old son hit William with surprising force. Throughout his life, he had often assumed that his father was too busy with royal duties or too focused on protocol to truly worry about him on a personal level. The idea that Charles had been anxiously watching for his arrival, feeling the same mixture of hope and fear that William himself had experienced, was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Is that true?" William asked, looking directly at his father. Charles nodded, his composure slipping slightly as he allowed himself to be vulnerable with his family. "I've been watching for you to come home for years, William. Not just today, but in every sense that matters. I've missed you more than you know." The weight of these words settled over the table like a warm blanket. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched her husband and father-in-law finally express the feelings they had both been carrying for so long. "I've missed you too, Papa," William said, the childhood name slipping out naturally. "I've missed having you as a father. Not just as a king or a mentor, but as someone I could talk to about the things that keep me awake at night." "Such as?" Charles asked gently, recognizing this as an opportunity for the kind of conversation they should have been having all along. William glanced at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly, then looked at his sons, who were listening with rapt attention despite the adult nature of the conversation. "I worry about being a good father while also preparing to be king," William admitted. "I worry about making the same mistakes that previous generations have made, about putting duty before family or allowing the pressure of the crown to change who I am at my core. When I see George growing up so fast, and realize that someday he'll face the same challenges I'm facing now, it terrifies me." Charles felt a profound recognition in his son's words. These were the exact fears he had grappled with when William and Harry were young, the constant tension between public responsibility and private love that had plagued the royal family for generations. "Do you know what I've learned this year?" Charles said, his voice taking on the wisdom that comes from facing mortality and emerging with new perspectives. "I've learned that being a good king and being a good father aren't opposing forces. They're the same thing, approached from different angles. When we lead with love, when we prioritize the well-being of those entrusted to our care, whether that's our family or our subjects, we rarely go wrong." Louis, who had been quietly eating his way through the sandwich selection, suddenly looked up with a serious expression. "Papa, are you going to be king someday like Grandpa King?" The question, asked with a child's innocent curiosity, brought a smile to everyone's faces. "Yes, Louis," William replied. "Someday, when I'm much older, I'll be king. And someday after that, when George is older, he'll be king too." "Will you be scared?" Louis asked. William considered the question seriously, looking around the table at his family. "I probably will be scared sometimes, yes. But I hope I'll remember today, and how brave Grandpa King was to ask all of us to stand with him. Being scared doesn't mean we can't do important things. It just means we need people we love to help us be brave." Catherine smiled at her husband's response, proud of how he had learned to be honest about his vulnerabilities while still providing security for their children. "And you'll have all of us to help you," she added. "Just like we helped each other today." George, who had been thinking deeply about everything he had heard, suddenly spoke up. "Grandpa King, in your speech today, you talked about forgiveness. Are you and Papa forgiving each other for something?" The directness of the question caught both Charles and William off guard. They had been speaking in careful adult language about their relationship challenges, but George had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the clarity that children often possess. Charles and William looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that required no words. Years of accumulated hurts, misunderstandings, and missed opportunities for connection seemed to dissolve in that moment of honest recognition. "Yes, George," Charles said finally. "We are forgiving each other. Sometimes when people love each other very much, they can still hurt each other's feelings by accident. When that happens, the brave thing to do is to say you're sorry and to forgive each other so you can start fresh. Like when Louis and I fight about toys, but then we say sorry and play together again?" George asked. "Exactly like that," William replied, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair. "Except it took Papa and Grandpa King much longer to figure out what you and Louis already know." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. They talked about Christmas plans for the following day, about the boys' excitement over their gifts, and about Catherine's hopes for the new year. But underneath all of these casual exchanges, there was a new foundation of trust and understanding that hadn't existed that morning. As evening approached, the family gathered in the comfortable sitting room where a large television had been set up for them to watch the Christmas speech together. The room was warm and inviting, with a crackling fireplace and comfortable sofas arranged around the screen. "Are you nervous about watching ourselves?" Catherine asked as they settled in with mugs of hot chocolate. "A little," Charles admitted. "It's always strange to see oneself on television, but knowing that millions of people around the world will be watching with their own families makes it feel even more significant." The broadcast began with the familiar opening music and graphics, and then, there they were, the royal family as the world would see them, standing together in the blue drawing room with warmth and unity that was clearly genuine. "Look, there's Papa arriving!" Louis exclaimed as the cameras captured William's entrance and his movement to join the family. Watching the moment from the outside, they could all see what the viewing audience would see, not a staged photo opportunity, but a real family coming together despite their challenges and differences. The emotion on their faces was authentic, the love between them undeniable. When the speech concluded and the screen faded to black, the room was quiet for a long moment. They had just witnessed not only a Christmas message to the Commonwealth, but a documentation of their own journey toward healing and reconciliation. "I'm proud of all of us," Catherine said softly, breaking the silence. "So am I," Charles agreed. "Whatever challenges we face in the future, I believe we'll face them together." William stood up and moved to the window, where snow was still falling gently across the Windsor Castle grounds. His family joined him there, and they stood together looking out at the peaceful winter landscape. "Thank you," William said, addressing his father but including everyone in his gaze. "Thank you for reminding me what matters most. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to come home." Charles put his arm around his son's shoulders, a gesture that felt natural and right for the first time in years. "Thank you for having the courage to walk through that door today. You'll never know how much it meant to me." As the evening settled around Windsor Castle and families across the Commonwealth gathered to share their own Christmas celebrations, the royal family stood together at the window, watching the snow fall and feeling grateful for the gift of reconciliation that had made this Christmas truly special. Outside, the ancient oak trees stood like sentinels in the winter landscape, their bare branches reaching toward the star-filled sky. Inside the castle, a family that had found its way back to each other prepared to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that love, forgiveness, and second chances were the most precious gifts of all. The Christmas speech would be remembered as one of the most moving and authentic broadcasts in royal history, not because of its eloquent words or perfect staging, but because it captured a genuine moment of family healing that resonated with people around the world. For Charles, Catherine, William, George, and Louis, it would always be remembered as the Christmas when they learned that coming home to each other was the greatest gift they could give or receive. As they prepared to retire for the evening, each carrying with them the warmth of reconciliation and the promise of a stronger future together, the snow continued to fall softly on the grounds of Windsor Castle, covering the world in pristine white and creating the perfect ending to a perfect Christmas day of forgiveness, love, and new beginnings.